Good afternoon. It's Friday the 14th of December 2012. We're approaching the end of the world, but we're going to keep transmitting here at UK Column Live. So welcome to the programme today. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio is Mike Robinson.
Afternoon.
And I've got to say it's a horrible day in Plymouth, England. The rain is pounding on the windows, the sky is grey, it's cold, wet and miserable, but we're not going to bother about that. We'll get on with reporting what's been happening around the country. And the first topic we're going to cover is the subject of Sami al-Sadi, who is the gentleman who's just been awarded £2.23 million by the British government. He was dispatched back to Libya with his wife and 4 young children, where he says he was imprisoned and tortured. And we've now got a very interesting situation where it's proved beyond all doubt that we're now living in a police state, a dictatorship in Britain, because this is yet another court case held in a secret court, where we're now seeing the results of Mr. Blair's dirty visit to Libya in 2004 and his deal in the desert. And basically Britain is now assisting other countries to torture people. So we've seen people removed to America. And in this case, this gentleman and his family were sent back to Libya. Of course, the public is not told the truth as to what's gone on. The public is not shown the documents. The public is not given the detail. But no, this man is now being bought off, as is often the case, with a mere 2.23 million. The Mail article was particularly interesting in how it portrayed Tony Blair, because of course we see Mr. Blair, who many regard as being a war criminal and responsible for genocide in Iraq as well as Libya, is shown here with a halo. And
like an angel? An angel of death?
Well,
perhaps?
An angel of death, probably. I'd take people to get the wrong impression of Mr. Blair. And then in contrast, juxtaposition, of course, we have Gaddafi here, who is what? The villain in the piece. So the key question is, who is the real criminal? Was it Gaddafi or was it Tony Blair? Well, according to the present government, we're not to find out because everything's going to be kept behind closed doors. Mr. Miliband has been speaking out, and apparently he's been admitting that Labour made mistakes on immigration. This is a very interesting article from the Mail by its duplicitous language, because the headline here talks about mistakes on immigration, but if you then read into the article, we're actually talking about segregation and integration. But of course, Labour didn't make any mistakes at all over immigration, because we know from people inside London councils who were working with the early administrations that there was a deliberate plan to open Britain's borders in order to create a multicultural society. And as we have often said in our talks and presentations, of course, this doesn't reflect on the people who were invited into Britain, but it does reflect on the people who were actually creating the policy. In the article, and it's a bit small, so I've ringed it here, but it says the influx of immigrants, up to 3 million in a decade, outpaced the ability of communities to cope. And Mr. Miliband's now had to admit that. But of course, the key factor is here that the pressure of the immigration has now affected every type of society in Britain, including the families and children of long-standing immigrants. So our view from the UK column is, of course, that Mr. Miliband is putting up a smokescreen of lies and deceit to cover up what was a deliberate Labour policy, which is now being continued under agenda politics by David Cameron. Children's health, a subject dear to your heart, Mike.
Well, the next this section of it is really the attack on a further attack on children. So today, again on Radio 4's Today programme, they were discussing rickets. And so I wanted to highlight this. This is the Express saying this
Can I just interrupt you briefly?
Yeah.
But for anybody with good hearing who's worrying about the noise in the background, I don't know whether our microphones are picking up. The rain is pounding on the window. So if you thought we were joking about the weather in Plymouth today, I'm afraid not.
Pretty bad. Right, so getting back to this, doctors fear a return of the 19th century disease. If anybody isn't sure, rickets is a softening of the bones in children due to deficiency of vitamin D. And of course, there's a number of reasons why there's a deficiency in vitamin D in children. One is obviously the pressure on parents to avoid skin cancer, if that's a real problem, is causing them to put, factor whatever sun cream on, cover up their children. They're not getting the sunlight exposure that they need to get, and of course we've got this nasty business of air traffic and the amount of muck in the air as a result of
blotting out the sun. Well, we've also got children, of course, who are spending hour after hour after hour in their bedrooms on video games or the computer rather than getting out in the fresh air. So
that's right. So vitamin D deficiency is a growing problem now. As Ian Crane said yesterday, the pharmaceutical industry sees humanity as a cash cow from birth to death, and of course our culture is being it's a cultural thing. Is the reason that people are sitting inside all the time, watching television, playing video games, and covering children up. That then has the effect that our health is damaged, and of course we go running for supplements. When in fact all we really need is some sunlight exposure,
fresh air and exercise.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting that in Britain in 2012 we're now back into worrying about early 19th century diseases.
And of course, children's health is also being affected economically, because here we've got a headline from Yahoo News. This was on the radio again this morning, that in some places teachers are having to give food handouts to pupils who are not getting any breakfast in the morning, arriving in school without any packed lunch, not getting access to free school meals. And in some cases, teachers are feeling so sorry for the children that, well, in fact, partly because of behavioural problems in the classroom as well, due to hunger. So, this is an appalling situation that in 21st century Britain, we have teachers having to give handouts of food to pupils, and of course this has a long-term health implication as well. So we're being driven back into the hands of the pharmaceutical companies. And here we've got another headline from the Daily Mail this time, talking about poorer families cutting back on fruit and vegetables, and this is as a result of a survey showing that the drop in fruit and veg buying is 10% on average and 22% in low-income homes. I have to say that in some respects this is quite a surprise, because the price of meat is getting so horrendously expensive at the moment that I'm surprised that there's been a drop in
Well, I think part of that is maybe that people don't see. Some people are not used to seeing vegetables as food. I don't mean that in a flippant way. I think that there's been a move away from seeing that you can exist on a vegetarian type diet. So that's probably what it's about. But is it really the case that we in Britain in 2012 can't feed ourselves, can't feed our children? I'm sure that the average person in the street faced with this problem in their community could sort this out pretty quickly. But of course we've got Parliament stuffed with 640 odd MPs who now appear so corrupt and incompetent that they can't look after the primary role of the health and dietary needs of the nation. Some may consider that to be treason.
So a controversial one potentially, but the BBC told to put more gay presenters on children's TV to familiarise youngsters with different sexualities. And what the Mail is reporting here is that the BBC was called upon to ensure that audiences are familiarised with different sexualities, quote, from an early age. It claimed that it was important to help validate the feelings of gay children by incorporating representation within programming for children who are going through their formative years. The study claimed, so it's talking about a study that's claimed that too much time on the BBC is given to homophobic viewpoints. Well,
Well, we know exactly where the BBC is going to attempt to take the country, because it's in line with the cross-party agenda politics, and that is that it is not normal to be heterosexual. And of course what we're now starting to see government documents talking about is heteronormativity. This is all the focus around it is not normal to be heterosexual. And I think we'll say from the UK column live today that we know this is a very emotive subject. We do get a lot of emails from people who seem to get very, very hot under the collar if we touch the subject of the blatant promotion of gay lifestyles to young children. I'm going to say at this point that we are watching what is clearly government-sponsored propaganda being targeted on young children, and we are going to report the subject. So if anybody does like to write in and give us our views, please do. But our view at the moment is that we now have an extremely dangerous attack on the traditional heterosexual family, and this is being promoted by the government, and of course we can expect the BBC propaganda machine to fully come on board with that.
Yeah, this is just a subject which does not need to be promoted to young children, and I'm sure CBeebies will be running with this fair and square, but it shouldn't be done. Okay,
I've noticed we've got quite a bit of material from the Mail today, but those who watch us over a regular period know that we do cover all the mainstream press. It's just the way the stories have come up today. But we're sticking with the BBC here because the Mail's reporting that the BBC, which of course is constantly pleading poverty, the fact that it needs to get in more revenues from licence fees, that they've spent £1 million on BBC bosses jet setting back to the US in just 7 months. The total figure that's come out of a Freedom of Information request is that the BBC spent 1.135 million between April the 1st and October the 31st. So the key question here is not only how is the BBC able to waste taxpayers' money in this way, I think that the licence payer also needs to be informed as to why BBC executives need to be taking flights to the USA on such a regular basis. Could it be this is in order to help set the agenda for the BBC's global propaganda campaign? I may be a bit cynical on that, but we'll see.
Stop paying our TV licenses, switch the televisions off.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Billy Connolly has come out and said that elderly should be cared for by their children. He's saying that elderly people should be cared for by their own families at home rather than being confined to care homes. And he's also admitting that, of course, he's getting to the age where he's trying to encourage his children that in the not too distant future they should be looking after him. Now, I have to say that as a matter of principle, I absolutely agree with this. You know, this is the fact that he has to say it at all demonstrates the attack on the family over the last 40 years, as families have been, for economic reasons mainly, been forced to move away from their traditional family base.
Well, I think this is a very important point because, of course, for many families it's essential that both mum and dad have to go out to work, and of course this means that there is nobody at home to care for somebody on a full-time basis, and we're of course seeing more and more examples of where children are being put into school clubs in order to give parents either more working time or at least some breathing space in the day. So the economic attack is what's coming home here. But if we can just call that picture, if we can just get that back up on screen, I did wonder whether this is a posed photograph or Billy Connolly is in his home, because it looks palatial. And of course, if you're living in a mansion of this size, probably the ground floor of his hall is equivalent to my ground floor of my whole house. He's got plenty of room for doing a lot of things, but maybe that's a little bit cynical too. So one of the top stories, of course, is what has been happening around the tragic death of the nurse. And I don't think that UK column has ever known a single article which has produced such a such interest and response from people. We've had a flood of emails, texts and telephone calls where people are saying to us that they simply do not believe the story as it's being pushed out. And
well, I got a fantastic email from a lady called Kate today, just with a list of 16 questions that she has over this thing. I mean, for example, you might be covering this, but for example, the first question she's asking is, why has the family been given typed copies of the 3 handwritten notes left by the nurse? I mean, surely the last written correspondence of your child should be given to you as a written correspondence. It's incredible that this is being. How do you describe this? It's being sanitized in a certain way, and you've got to ask why.
Well, I absolutely. You would have thought that close relatives, a husband, would be shown the letter. I mean, if what would try to give you some closure, I think, is to be shown a genuine letter. So there's something odd about what's going on here. Yeah.
So I think later on we'll maybe publish these questions. They're very good questions, and people can respond to them in due
accordingly.
Course.
But
yes.
we're going to say to viewers and listeners that if you have an interest in this case, and if you have concerns, if you have information, we are very, very interested in hearing from you, and we're certainly interested in understanding more as to why Mr. Vaz has suddenly been pushed forward to be the guardian of the family. But I'll just call up here, this is one of the comments that we received, because we've had a number of people who've said it's very interesting that, of course, the hospital is claiming that they didn't put any pressure on staff and they've done their best to care for staff. We've had another number of comments from people who say that they know about this hospital. And this first one here said, I had a chat with a friend, and when I told her that the nurse had died last week, she immediately said, I bet she got a roasting by the hospital. There's another one here. The nurse would have been put through hell by the management. I worked there and I know and have first-hand experience of the way they treated staff. I worked at King Edward VII Hospital. Nurses were never supported in any way if incident happened. Bad publicity was a no-no. That's a very interesting statement. And the nurse was going to get the blame, not the radio station. I could write a book on the hospital and the way staff were treated. So some very interesting comments coming in from the public, people claiming that they were working at the hospital. But we've got some other things here. The coroner, we find this quite bizarre. Coroner Fiona Wilcox has fixed a provisional date for a full inquest on March the 26th, which would have been Jacintha's 47th birthday. Now this seems to me unbelievably callous by the coroner, or is this deliberate? Is there some reason that they want to identify they want to identify this date? I think it's unbelievably cruel, and I'm interested as to what the coroner was up to. I think I might have just jumped sequence here. Let me just do a quick check. No, okay. I thought we had a picture of the coroner. She may pop up in a little bit later on. Of course, do we have a free and independent press? Well, our view at UK Column is, of course, we don't. So all sorts of things are going on. But this is a very interesting headline from The Sun, which is really pointing a finger at Maria Miller, who, of course, is the lady who's allegedly been threatening the Telegraph and other media people because they've dared to start to question her expenses. So we watch this with great interest, but of course Cameron is prepared to stand up and threaten the media. You need to do what I say. We've now got other people in the cabinet, and of course Cameron has fully supported this lady. So it seems to us that if you get near any form of expenses scandal, you can expect David Cameron to support you. But is this actually more of an indication that we're going to have an elite in Parliament and they are untouchable by the press and media? Maybe. I'll just jump back here. I knew this slide was somewhere, but of course it's very, very interesting that the coroner being used for the case of Jacintha the nurse is the very same lady that was involved with Gareth Williams, who was the MI6 body in the bag saga. So I don't know whether there's anything in this. If we can just, this was one of the original Mirror articles on this, but it does seem very, very interesting that in what was clearly at the time a very strange story which involved manoeuvring at high level of the British government and the Secret Service, we use a coroner, and she's the same person that's brought in on this case. Perhaps we're being too suspicious.
Perhaps.
Not.
So, Sally Bercow is going to be in the High Court facing Lord McAlpine then. So McAlpine has demanded, he is demanding £50,000 libel damages and an apology from Bercow after her Twitter post in which he claimed linked him with allegations of child sex abuse. Of course, her Twitter post did no such thing. Her Twitter post merely said that his name was trending and didn't comment on what it was trending for. But I'm highly suspicious of this whole situation. Perhaps Sally Bercow is what might be termed by common purpose a useful idiot, but there's just something about this whole thing.
Dirty.
The way that she is.
So we can say that basically, if Lord McAlpine is successful and he gets his £50,000, we've now got a precedent for anybody who tweets or Twitter that they can expect the state or the person to come after them for money.
My personal view is that the whole McAlpine thing needs to be seen in the context of the defamation bill in Levison, and that this is one whole big operation to shut down freedom of speech in the media and on the internet. And
of course we've got people saying that this is exactly what is going on around the tragic death of the nurse, is that Levison is there in Australia now whipping up exactly the same thing where there are calls for regulation of the press and media and the internet in Australia. It is an amazing coincidence. And we've got to remember that that McAlpine was paid £185,000 by the BBC and £125,000 plus costs by ITV. What for? There was no due process, there was no legal process. They just held up their hands and said, here's six-figure sum. Well, something we could add to this is it's possible, of course, that Lord Patton, head of the BBC Trustees, doesn't even know what the BBC is doing. UK columns recently written to him. We received a reply and then discovered that, of course, the reply didn't come from Lord Patton. He hadn't even seen our original letter. So maybe that's a mistake, but we understood from Robert Green, of course, who's been investigating for years the Holly Gregg abuse case. He has also received the same treatment, so he's written to Lord Patton on the serious subject of child abuse. He receives a reply, but then discovers that Lord Patton hasn't even seen the letter. So what we don't know at the moment is who in the BBC is actually writing letters back as if they are Lord Patton. It's a very interesting situation, isn't it? Yeah. Something weird going on. So your friend David Cameron has been up to things. Well, as we reported yesterday, he's been in Europe to discuss European integration and further federalisation of the financial areas first. But what was interesting about this article is that the deal that they've done will allow the European Central Bank to directly supervise 200 banks, none of which are British. And of course, Cameron is being presented as the man who's gone over and represented Britain's interests, and he's done no such thing. He's actually represented the interests of the City of London because this whole deal is to protect the City of London from European financial regulations. And has got absolutely nothing whatever to do with British interests at all. Yeah, and you've brought this together with the Bank of England is getting in some fairly mucky waters at
well,
the moment.
as usual, but Alex Salmond is pretty concerned about what's going to happen when Scotland becomes independent.
Right, we better explain this because the print's a bit small for people on
the headline
screen,
is Bank of England denies that it's in talks with the SNP on independence. So the bank's saying that they're not in direct talks with the SNP, but in fact they are answering technical questions that are put to it by the SNP. Basically, Alex Salmond wants to form, once Scotland is an independent sovereign nation, which is laughable in itself, he wants to form a sterling zone, a bit like the Eurozone. He wants to form a sterling zone so that multiple independent nations will use sterling as their national currency. And you know, we've got to say that we've seen the success of that in Europe, and to use the same model here looks to me like a direct attack on Britain's.
Well, I just look at this, that part of the attack on the whole of the United Kingdom, it doesn't matter whether you're Scots, Welsh or English, these people are making monkeys out of all of us, that we're moving nuclear assets north of the border at the time when Alex Salmond and the SNP are saying we don't want nuclear assets north of the border. Scotland wants independence. Well, it doesn't want independence because it wants to stay with the pound. It's chaos, but it's organised chaos. This have we reached the stage that we can't actually think for ourselves? We can't use common sense. I don't believe this is true. I think what we're watching here is deliberate chaos being introduced by this cross-party agenda so that the voter, the average person in the country, supposedly will not understand that we're actually under attack. By their fruits ye shall know them, I think, is part of it. So George as well.
So after we mentioned that the new governor of the Bank of England wants to scrap the inflation target, Georgie Boy is coming out and saying that he wants to do the same, or he's asking for people's opinions on whether he should do the same. And of course, as I pointed out the other day, this is about the danger of inflation getting out of control. They don't want to use inflation as a target for the Bank of England in the future. They want to use so-called economic growth, and of course they can define what economic growth is at any point in time.
Yeah, and they can lie.
As they have done and as they will continue to do. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And of course we should remember that George Osborne is a very, very wealthy man, so presumably he's not going to have trouble feeding himself, and he won't have trouble feeding any of his family or looking after them. So the sheer hypocrisy here from this nasty party, I think that many people have called them. But of course they're working hand in glove with Miliband's boys anyway. And we're dropping on the living table. On the living standards table is really what it is. So you know, it kind of goes back to the first couple of stories. We know that people are starting to suffer in this country. This is fairly misrepresentative, I think, this living standards table, but nonetheless, the fact that they're acknowledging that Britain is dropping down the list, I mean, it's fairly obvious to us all that the living standards are falling. The question here is, how fast are we falling relative to other European countries? And it seems that in general we're falling faster than other European countries. Okay, and if we look for the root of the problem, of course, we're going to come directly to the banking industry, where it's becoming very interesting in America at the moment. So America is actually prosecuting banks, as we know. Barclays has had to pay out $450 million or something, for something close to that, for the LIBOR scandal. HSBC has had its $1.2 billion fine last week, this week, and now we've got UBS, a $1 billion fine again for LIBOR. So you've got to say that if Barclays only paid $450 million for its problems, and UBS is paying double that, then UBS must be double must have had double the scam going that Barclays had. So, do you think perhaps the BBC was spending so much time in America because they were going over there to see what was happening with Barclays as a result of Marcus Agius, who was until recently taking £47,000 for 28 days' work from the BBC and heading up Barclays? I don't know. Maybe they were covering that. However, while this is all going on in the States, in the UK, Andrew Bailey, who currently works for the Financial Services Authority,
and is soon to be the chief executive of the new Prudential Regulation Authority, which is the replacement. He is now saying that banks are too big to prosecute, raising very difficult questions for regulators. So he's saying the largest banks have become too big to prosecute because of the impact criminal charges would have on confidence in them.
Well, actually, of
Isn't
course,
this staggering? Actually?
Well, no, I love the headline because, of course, if you say somebody is too big to prosecute, what you're actually saying is they are above and beyond the law.
Yeah.
So the simple statement here is that not only are the banks out of control, but they can absolutely do what they like in a criminal sense because they're above the law. That's what this man is really saying.
That's what he's trying to say.
And of course, these are the banks who are being fully supported by David Cameron, George Osborne, Miliband and Clegg. So we now know that we have politicians in power in Britain who are prepared to fully support criminal action as long as it's within the banking community. But woe betide anybody who's going to steal a loaf of bread. It's in our faces, isn't it? We
Absolutely.
are dealing with a criminal elite at the moment. And follow the money, follow the money.
Speaking of criminal elites, right, so we've got the Queen. Now, this is very interesting, not so much because of the Queen visiting the Bank of England, but once again, we've got these photographs of all the gold in the Banks of England, this time in the Bank of England. This time the Queen is having a look around. A few days ago, we had a video from an academic because he had been to look around. So once again, we've got the same, more or less the same photographs of all the gold in the Bank of England. And as I said the other day, I believe this is basically the Bank of England sticking its fingers up at all the countries that own this gold and individuals who own this gold, because not very much of the gold in the Bank of England vaults belongs to Britain. The rest belongs to other nations. And of course, when the stuff really happens with the financial system, when it finally goes, the people that are holding the physical assets are going to be the ones that survive. Yeah. And if you're a foreign nation that happens to have your gold reserves protected by the Bank of England, well, you might get a piece of paper saying that the Bank of England owns or holds a promissory note of some kind, but you're not going to get your gold.
Yeah.
So I'm just fascinated that again we've got the press with more or less the same photographs.
Actually, if it's the end of the week, so we're allowed to be a little bit light-hearted, particularly as the weather is so appalling and depressing today. It just occurred to me that perhaps we could use the facility in the studio here to get bars of gold as the backdrop to UK Column Live, actually. Okay. It'd add a bit of sparkle.
Perhaps you're suggesting that people should send us some bars of gold?
Yes, of course. So a bit of overseas news here, but the situation in the Middle East is continuing to be stoked up. So Yahoo News reporting here that the Pentagon is to send missiles and 400 troops to Turkey. So step by step we're seeing the pressure ramped up on Syria. Well,
we're certainly seeing NATO getting closer and closer to Syria's borders. It really can't be too long before NATO's walking across those borders, can it?
Yeah. So government policy in Britain is, of course, to depose Assad, and we now know that from the United Nations has said that this man will not effectively be allowed asylum. So at the moment, unless the wider public speak out and start to stop what's happening, we can expect to see Assad murdered with the help and connivance of the British government. Of course, the government is well used to lying on a number of fronts, and The Guardian's been very helpful here because it's flagging up that our old friend Francis Maude has been saying that this wonderful transparent government is releasing so much data and that people should use it. And he also says that people should use it in order to hold the government to account, to challenge departments, to challenge accounts, and of course to bring criminal activity to the fore. So we better just have a look at Francis Maude so that we can see him. Of course, the hypocrisy starts when Mr. Francis Maude and his department are continuing to block release of all data to deal with the contracts which have allowed Common Purpose to train the top 200 British civil servants, and indeed where civil servants have been loaned out to assist Common Purpose. So Francis Maude is remarkably squeamish about releasing information to do with contracts and money when it impinges on the close workings of his department, the Cabinet Office, and his actions with leadership. Quite extraordinary, really. I think that's about bringing us to the end of the session today. So we've covered a number of points. If anybody is in any doubt as our approach as to what's going on in the country, UK Column and the live team fully believe that we are now being attacked by our own government, and that is a cross-party agenda. The aim is to break up the United Kingdom and thereby to leave the country so weakened we're subsumed into the mess which is the European Union. So if you're north of the border in Scotland, look at it from that angle. Many people in Scotland are telling us that Salmond does not represent them, and they regard him as a scamster at the moment over so-called independence. We've got the same thing starting to happen in Wales, and of course many people in England. But if we want to get to the bottom of this, party politics is being used against us, and we need to get some decent people in Westminster. So on that happy note, we'll leave you to think about it over the weekend. Do join us on Monday at 12 o'clock, and we'll lead you into the Christmas period. Thanks very much.
Thanks.